So preparing live stream. We are supposedly live. I'm also going to record it. Wait, where's the recording button? Oh, there it is. Okay. There we go. We are live, baby.
All right.
Still got the stupid Zoom thing in the bottom, but
Are we on
whatever.
YouTube or Twitch right now?
We're on YouTube. I don't like the way Twitch displays it, and the fact that Opus uses the YouTube link instead of the Twitch link. So better to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So, Fred, you want to talk about Mission Impossible? Let's go. Let's talk about it. Hello, everybody. We are Fred and Min. This is temporarily WCBH unless we come up with a better name at some point. But, you know, fuck it. If you are viewing this, then you are either a dear friend or you just stumbled upon us on the internet because we're not marketing this yet. So welcome. Or this is like in the forever, like in the you know, if this ever becomes a bigger thing, you know, people refer to this back, you know, as a, oh, look at this, back when we were trying to figure it out, back before we wore suits on the live stream, you know.
Anyway, the origin story.
The origin story. How's it going, Fred?
It's
so
good.
Fred and I saw Mission Impossible day before yesterday. So 7. We're big fans of Tom Cruise, diehard Tom Cruise fans. Although I haven't seen all of his films. I wouldn't be surprised if you've seen all of his films.
I've probably seen a lot of his films. I mean, they're mostly big famous films. So they're kind of hard to miss.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny thinking about how his career has evolved, and now he's just this blockbuster action hero. You know,
I don't know. I think it's all like these sort of generational kind of cultural narratives that it's interesting. I'm curious how, you know, who's that person now that like is like what, I mean, I get, is it Harry Styles? Is it Zac Efron? Like, who are these people that are sort of, you're watching them grow up as sort of like cultural icons? I also wonder if culture even does that anymore, like in a way that I think everything used to be so like kind
like
of like
the Beatles,
like demigod, like that these kinds of A-list celebrities, like right. Almost like they didn't walk on earth. They just sort of, you know, graced the screens in a way that I think being a famous person now is much more tactile, and social media is a bigger expectation of like, you know, being a star. Like, you know, LeBron James is a very different type of sports star than Michael Jordan in terms of right. How much he, even as a life mission, sees his role as interacting with people in a way that Michael Jordan just says, I want to make a lot of money and play really great basketball. Right. I don't mean to reduce Michael Jordan. I'm sure there's something else.
How dare you?
But I'm just saying,
don't mess with the GOAT.
But you watch like The Last Dance. It seems like it is another era of like stardom in terms of like how elusive these people are. And I think Tom Cruise is of that like Gen X, you know, era that I can relate to. That he, you know, was this person that you couldn't see in public. You would never bump into Tom Cruise anywhere.
Well, I mean, I guess that's where Taylor is, though, right? Would you say Taylor Swift is demigod-like and is coming from a more recent? I mean, she's definitely from an older generation, but she is more recent than, you know, than Tom.
Sure,
Tom's
but
era,
interestingly, right? And I think she's probably so famous that she can't walk around in public, and it would probably be prohibitive to, you know, traffic in any street. But but admittedly, if I know enough about her fan base and the way she like she's very interactive. Like her social media is very.
Oh, you mean like, it's kind of a different type of celebrity? You mean
it's one that sort of recognizes that either her, you know, selfish success is based off of constantly stoking the fan base, or that's who she really is, and that's what makes her interesting to this generation, is that she is that person. It's probably a little bit of both, but like. I think it's interesting to look at Tom Cruise as someone who's still arguably relevant to the general public. I mean, I'd be curious how much Gen Z kids really care, and then that I'm sure it's much less than people like me. but like, it's
Mm,
still like noisy. Like it's a big part of, something that happened this week.
right.
But,
Well, maybe Barbie's probably more resonant with a younger crowd, right?
or at
I
least
would
at
imagine.
least the marketing world wants us to believe that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I think it's interesting how this is the weekend of Barbenheimer, and how much is Tom Cruise bristling, saying like,
Oh, oh, you're right.
like just to
Didn't
think
think about
like,
that.
as if those are the only two movies that are worth noting
Right,
this.
right.
And I get it. They're probably too, but it's like to think like, guys, like the guy that like arguably like brought everybody back to movie theaters around this time last year,
Right. Right.
seems to, like, in spite of his alien status, seems to really care about pumping the movie industry. And
Right.
like, and I know that he gets into a fight with Christopher Nolan about where the IMAX screens are, but he's still like doing a good thing for the broader industry, you know? I don't know.
I mean,
He can't be happy about it.
no, you're right. You're right. Because all the news articles are talking about that. He did not catch the marketing wave, which is probably why he was like negotiating with the studios to be out marketed, because he's been out marketed by this like, mutant Barbenheimer thing.
Yeah. But to go back to your
I
question,
mean,
like, I mean, he's such an interesting specimen because he's sort of, I personally think either this type of celebrity is diminishing as culture continues to spread, and there's a different kind of consumer experience for culture than there was like when everybody would just watch the same 3 or 4 movies every summer.
well, I guess
But also like just even his personality and it's you were with our friends that they were saying how like
yeah,
he's also just like a bit of an alien in his human interactions. Like he would be terrible at social
right,
media. Like he
right.
would say dad jokes the whole time or something. He would, and it wouldn't even be disarming. You'd just be like, that's weird. Like you're not supposed to say that. Like, anyway, what do you think? Like, what are you reacting to?
I mean, I guess it's interesting because there is that your point that you're making about like whether or not this type of celebrity is still possible or is still being created. At the same time, there's this ironic thing that I keep thinking about a lot lately, which is the Drake thing, which is the Drake being remixed with AI, and how he kind of raises think about it. Of course, like a month or two later, he's like signing a deal with some AI company to do stuff with them. But I think maybe his team or he realized that what I think I've realized is that AI and social media as well has helped to accelerate big brands, not and celebrities, not limit them, which I think was kind of interesting when the blogosphere was a thing, and I was a big blogger back then. And I think social media was coming up, and I think a lot of people were thinking, "Oh, the blogs are going to replace New York Times. People are going to read New York Times anymore." There was this kind of dialogue happening, and then, of course, you fast forward like 5 years later, it's like, no, because the blogs and the social media make it so noisy. Now the New York Times is this brand that I can latch onto.
I mean,
It's kind of interesting.
this guy that I follow pretty closely on in LinkedIn,
Yeah.
that I think is like in all of the conversations we have about tech and media and culture, like I think he's as sort of noisy in all 3 of those spaces and pretty sharp. This guy Evan Shapiro, he just recently on his Substack published this big long piece, kind of as like an analysis of how like New York Times is like the case study for what the sort of the collapsing media industry needs to pay attention to. That here's an example of like as old a legacy business as you can imagine, that very, very effectively adapted. And they reiterated, they changed their leadership, they tried things, they burnt money along the way, and they really switched to being a digital.
They also acquired a lot of people, like Wirecutter, right? Didn't they acquire
Yeah.
538 as well? They acquired a bunch of new types as well.
Yeah, maybe.
But I'm just saying that
Yeah.
verifies what you're saying, because they not only are they investing in their people, they're changing leadership, but they're also acquiring or acqui-hiring, people who might, infuse their culture with something more young or more modern.
But I'm just saying, I think there's even an episode's worth of analysis of how is the New York Times adapted and how and why were they successful at it. But I'd even just on some basic level, I think that the reason that blogosphere moment is that just the sheer volume of content that the New York Times puts out, like you just can't, you can't compete with that amount, even if you're Vice or whoever. And I guess that's kind of like my curiosity.
I also think they're in New York,
I mean, it's a major media market.
Cutting edge city.
but it's a
Mm.
major media market. So
Major
I mean,
media market,
that's a fuck ton of people. But like, I don't know. I guess I'm just curious, like you posted yesterday that link to those AI shorts that are like scarily effective and wow,
Right.
somebody just typed in a few words and they came out
Right.
with something that was very poetic and beautiful. I guess I'm really curious, like, okay, when we all get flooded with this stuff, does anybody really watch it? Like, I think it's
Well, that's
interesting.
a
I think it's interesting that it's arty and that it's like, wow, I kind of thought only humans could do that. Like, great, okay. But like, I think it's possible that the sort of the main giant things will remain giant, and if anything, be even more shored up because they can do what the New York Times did, is they can just flood the marketplace against all these like little things that you would think is a death by a thousand cuts. But I think in the end, like the razor stops working and it's not going to
yeah.
kill you. You know, like it's like at some point, I almost think these kinds of moments of chaos, almost you could argue they almost effectively. I mean, I think that seems to be what people are saying that's happening with Netflix, is that Netflix might be last person standing after all this chaos settles
Right.
because of how disruptive they were to everything. Not because they were good at it, not because they were fundamentally
Right.
sound, but because they created a chess move that checkmated everybody. And
Right.
that's some dark shit, you know, like to think
Right.
that by burning it all down, they end up winning.
Right.
But you know, and then, you know, they get to pretend like they're friends of the artist too. So it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think we're in this age of power struggle. And in some ways it's now
Well,
come
yeah.
knocking at the doors of culture. It used to be
Well, it's funny because
politics and money and wealth. You know?
I mean, did you watch that James Vanderbeek? He's saying everything that everybody else is saying, but I think in that video, it made me think about the Industrial Revolution a little bit more. You know, not that that hasn't been a trope already since AI dropped, but it feels like it more because, like, you know where the term Luddites came from?
I don't.
It
I'm
actually
excited
came
to
from
learn.
socks. It all has to do with socks because what happened was that all these people were making socks and stockings and by hand, and of course the loom was invented, and then they started making looms, and then what happened was these Luddites, this group of people who used to make socks, went and burned down these factories and these looms because and of course that's what this feels like. It's like that's what at least that's what James Vanderbeek's video feels like, because he's like, yo, AI are gonna lap us at some point, and what are we gonna do? And it's funny because look, the looms won in the end, right? I mean, people are still manning looms,
but it's not just. And I think the thing
that
is some humbling in this as everybody at some point starts projecting themselves into the different protagonists in this. Like, okay, am I the person that cares about the artist, or am I a person that cares about progress or something? Like, there's all these sort of dramatic tugs of like what's right or what's wrong, what should be or what shouldn't be. But the messed up thing is that the main protagonist in all of these situations is the consumer. And as much as we can get angry at any of these entities for having done anything to anybody, if you're worried about will AI replace everybody, the first person you should be fighting to win over is the consumer, not the studios.
Right.
Is like, does the consumer like it? And do they then turn it into a product that's worth shipping? Right. And if they do, then it doesn't matter what's right or wrong. It's what's starting to happen. That's what happened when I keep thinking of a lot of these things as being relevant to what Napster did to music. Like, if the consumer loved the compact disc, if they thought it was a truly wonderful value proposition to have this rainbow, spinning disc, they wouldn't have ever run towards free MP3s. But the truth is they thought that product sucked and they prefer this one, which is free. And they think that and in some ways it started upending what was the perceived value of the product of music, because the consumer, it didn't care about the plight of the artist. They didn't, for all those Metallica fans that had been paying $19 a CD, they kind of didn't care that Lars Ulrich was so pissed off about Napster. They just didn't. So I'm saying, if you want to get angry at anybody, and if you want to desperately plead with anybody of like, please don't destroy Hollywood, somehow communicate this to people with
even then, I'm not convinced that is gonna, like, I'm not convinced that anybody does anything consciously necessarily. Like, I think we do it on an individual basis. Like, I choose to go to the movie theater with you, but I don't think that I necessarily, or as a group of us, as a group, are like, we're gonna stick with CDs. It's interesting because the LP has resurged, right?
But you're making my
books
point.
and no, I am. I'm not disagreeing with you. And like it's interesting that LPs and books specifically have resurged, right? In an era where everybody thought, hey, books are done and LPs are old. It's like, well, LPs, record players made it because
I bet CDs have a moment.
I don't think they will. That I'll disagree with you. But like I think that it's interesting that, hey, you have this like these LPs have this sexiness to them. There's that lossless quality of the audio or whatever. And then books, of course, people want books because whatever, there's plenty of reasons to want books and they're better than consuming movies in a lot of ways. But I think that speaks to, for me, hey, these mediums continue to be relevant despite the fact that there are better mediums in other respects. But like the consumer, in my opinion, will never choose consciously what is better to them. They will all just go for what's better, consciously or subconsciously.
No, but I think that's
and so point, like I think
the ruthless honesty of the consumer experience is that they don't sit there and weigh the morality of how does this affect people downstream in the supply chain. They just, or upstream in the supply chain, they just go, how do I get this? And which is what Netflix tapped into and disrupted. They offered like the apple in the Garden of Eden, which is like, I don't know, have everything whenever you want, as much as you want, all the time. And then who doesn't say yes to that? But the problem is that then that starts to disrupt some of the stability that sort of allowed this thing to be an industry. And then maybe this is time for that disruption to happen. I don't know.
I mean, if I look at two things. One is I look at the content economy in general, and I think this is when we get a Fawn on, it's worth kind of digging into it because I'm curious about his kind of more techie perspective. But like everything in content sucks. Like the starving artist is verified by data, which is that 80% of any given content related field is poverty. Right, like there's a reason why Asians and others are kind of like, what are you doing being an artist? You got to be an engineer. What are you doing? Like if you look at the engineer average salary or doctor average salary or even nurse average salary, it's way better than any average salary of a writer or even a journalist or any actor or any of these things, right? Because the median in those industries is so bad. And then of course there's going to be the top Ryan Gosling, Tom Cruise, etc., who are going to be making like $1 billion or millions of dollars. But it's interesting and then my other thinking around this is cobblers, because I watched recently a documentary about cobblers. And it was really interesting because do I buy an Air Jordan 1 that's manufactured in a factory? Maybe it's handmade, I don't know, but this is clearly a mass-produced product that I enjoy because it has a fashion element to it and there's the Nike brand behind it, blah, blah, blah. Or do I want this like custom-made cobbled shoe made in England, that I paid maybe $1,000 for some guy to hand make it for me because it's based specifically on my exact foot. Which it was funny because in the documentary, I was like, well, this thing is dying, right? Like there's very few people, but there is still a demand. They're like oversubscribed, right? There's people, very wealthy people, especially, who are coming to them every day who want a perfect shoe molded exactly to their foot. But then at the same time, there's a mass produced thing. I don't even know what point I'm making here, but it's just kind of crazy that these two demands exist, right? And one has still survived because it's got this like allure, this customness, et cetera, but obviously everybody wants the Nike shoe, right? Nobody's thinking about a cobbler shoe, and that is probably going to take place here. And I wonder if it's going to take place here. Is that a good thing for theater? Actually, that's the point I'm kind of thinking about, is like, what does that mean for theater versus a film, which could be like, let's say in 5-10 years you're going to see Mission Impossible 10 and it's mostly CGI and maybe Tom is in it, but it's mostly CGI. Or do you go to an actual theater and you pay, $500-$600 to see Hamilton, because that's going to be, what's his name is going to be on stage. I forget his name now.
I mean,
that's something people have said before, right?
I think you call it, did you call it the creator? Is that what creator economy?
The content economy. So, which includes the creator economy, which includes writers, journalists, musicians, the film industry,
Sure.
right? Where by the way, all of these industries are growing, right? The film industry is like projected to beat where it was in 2019 in the next few years. But all that to say, like all of these industries are way bigger than they were like when they got disrupted, right? The disruption happened, like you watch the music industry's revenues, it dips, and then suddenly iTunes and everything is introduced, and then boom, we're back over where it was, but musicians are making less, right? Because now they're competing with each other on Spotify. There's way more musicians competing for a bigger pie, but they're getting less of that pie because Harry Styles is gonna, and Taylor Swift are gonna consume most of the pie. We love Taylor Swift and Harry Styles, but they're also eating the lunch of every other musician that is not listening to them, right? Or that is listening to them, right? So it's an interesting dilemma, right? Where you have this kind of like, and this is how it is in every industry, to be fair, right? Every industry is subject to a power curve, but our capitalistic economy is so brutal that you really, really, really have to love a thing to like go with it. And like I look at what, I was struck with Welcome to Wrexham, which I love the show, but it was kind of like, oh, these guys all get minimum wage. These guys make less than I do, to play a game, and they're happy because they get to be paid to play soccer every day.
I don't know. I guess I just think there's a bigger macro thing that might be happening. I mean, there's like an article that this might be the summer of strikes. Like it sounds like the Postal
100%.
Service is about to strike. Like
right.
there's other industries that aren't getting as much attention because they don't have media obsessed with them, like film and Hollywood. But
right.
there is, I mean, my wife, who doesn't care about any of the things we talk about, sort of observes some of this stuff, and it says like there's almost like a return of a labor movement in a way that there's
right.
many documented chapters of history to learn from, which I wish I could say I know as much. But I guess like what underlies that idea that there's a right, that means that like the culture, like culture is a bit of a feedback loop. Like at some point, all of these different content economies that you're talking about, like are expressions and consumed products of the same entity. Like right. Taylor Swift is expressing people's sadness and happiness in music, and then that is packaged up into a product that the same people that are feeling that sadness and happiness then consume. So at some point, there's sort of like a willing partnership between the consumers of these things and the people that make it. And now like, it feels like there's something that's resisting the assumptions in that kind of stuff. And I don't know, I mean, this is a real blue sky thing to throw out there, but part of me really wonders, like zoomed out, like if Martians landed on Earth and told us, why are you guys all doing it this way? You should do it this way. Or what will AI come to the logical conclusion of like
tax the rich,
all the
tax the rich, remove the millionaires.
No, but I'm saying, but even that's a tactical comment. I'm saying, where is your value, and how are you as a species supporting it?
Well, it's funny that you say that.
I'm some super like, maybe the Yuval Harari is talking these terms, but I'm saying like the idea that there's this much attention and stress and public warfare over the business of distracting people at prime time, of like just like let's make TV and film for people, like the business of capturing people's imaginations and giving them an experience to pretend like they're a secret spy, to saving the world. The amount of work and business, it does seem disproportionate for a world that possibly should be focusing on climate change and whatever. But I mean, not to sort of even have the data in front of me to say this. I guess I'm just saying, I feel like we're watching a collision of people's assumptions of what are we even doing here? And in some like Plato's Republic of philosopher kings that sort of, delegate all the right things for society instead of letting democracy ruin it, like, I do wonder, like, are there things like music, art, and all these cultural things that wouldn't get bogged down in this chaos of commerce, because it would just sort of live in this sort of like PBS model where it's just funded to be, and then the things that are because they're culturally valuable, not just that they might make somebody rich or something. Like there's just something like, and I know this is all human, like humans created capitalism. It's not like some Martians introduced commerce to us. So I'm saying that I just think you're watching like a grand human experiment that I think up until recently, a lot of this stuff often revolves around just finance or money or political power. the fact that culture is the currency of this struggle, like movies, stories, music, art, the fact that that's the thing that we're fighting over, to me is kind of fascinating, because it's kind of an intrinsic good, the idea of art.
I agree.
Like people pay for admission to the Musée d'Orsay or the Louvre.
Right.
There's clearly some type of keeping the lights on money, but I'm sure if you looked under the hood, there's a lot of government subsidies. There's a lot
100%.
of public taxes that support that,
Right.
in the way that the airline industry is, if it were left to its own devices, would never
Well,
put a plane in the air, but the world has decided it's important that people fly around, so it's subsidized. I'm saying, at which point do we ever enter a moment that some of these things that we assume should be left to the whims of the marketplace, especially when they affect people's jobs and livelihoods and sort of the end user experience? Is it possible that commerce is corrupting the crap out of something that is meant to be a public good?
Yeah, that's an age-old conversation, I guess. It's a tough one.
But I think that's
because I think
when a labor movement gets involved. I guess that's sorry to interrupt you. I'm just saying that's my point. The fact that there's a labor movement, it's like asking about the economic soundness of this proposition. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, I think that I guess the point of earlier, what I'm saying about the content economy and the kind of the calculations I've been doing, which hopefully we'll kind of get into, but it's like, I think it's massively undervalued. Like, as much as the New York Times, if you can dispute and you think that New York Times is which I've definitely not been happy with New York Times for the last like 5 years or so, but like, it is a major cultural institution that is in a lot of ways the vanguard of Western media, right? Alongside many others, but it's like that company makes $2 billion a year. That's all it makes. It's about 2 billion, maybe more. But it's like, and then Google, which, of course makes a ton of products and definitely has cultural relevance and is a technology beast, and so makes $279 billion a year. So it makes an order of magnitude more than New York Times, but is arguably a less like relevant cultural artifact for humanity, right? In some ways, right? From some perspectives. And the same thing is true, I think, from any of these things. And I think about what you're saying in context of like China specifically, like that. I do think that LA and Hollywood are valuable as our soft power, right? And if we lose that edge, we lose something very important to the Western world, to America, et cetera. Like, that's a part of our influence. It's a part of why, hey, people still are immigrating here every day, and like I just saw like there's actually Chinese people are immigrating through the Mexican border, right? Like, it's kind of, it's crazy, right? And so like, I think a part of that is not just, it's the perception of what America is, and it is extremely valuable just from a nationalistic point of view, but definitely like from a humanity view, like what is the best thing about humanity, right? And who is asking the deeper questions and who's promoting these deeper questions and reminding us what it is to live for. I think when you strip away the entertainment side, which is definitely a big component there, like the reason why I love entertainment and the reason why I keep watching television and stuff is because I feel deep things when I watch The Bear, right? Or I watch something and it reminds me of my humanity and makes me feel like I have, there's more to humanity, all these things, right? Humanness or whatever. And I feel like that's underappreciated, but I don't know. I mean, but I don't think that there is a business model where, all the artists get food stamps. Like, I mean, unless it's like UBI, but even then, like, it's weird. Everything's out of whack, because at the same time, I'm like, look, it costs billions of dollars to launch a satellite into space, and that satellite serves billions of people on Earth. And I understand the engineering and the ingenuity and the human work that went into putting that satellite into space so that I can get from point A to point B. There's a high value to that. Right.
But I don't know. Like, did you ever read Plato's Republic? Are you familiar with the reference?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Right. So Philosopher Kings and to anybody that doesn't. So like Plato's Republic is this like old school, like college, philosophy book that is his sort of.
Let's not call it a college philosophy. Let's call it one of the greatest philosophical
No, but
texts of
I'm saying
all time.
it's a bit of a tradition in college to have read this in your freshman year. It's like one of those books you read in college.
Sure.
But yes, it is
Sure,
a
but it
seminal.
is also the reason for that. By the way, for viewers, it is one of the greatest texts of all time.
But is that
Right.
so seminal text of
Foundational
Western, right.
Western, yeah, it is like the Western blah blah blah.
So in it, at some point, there's a dialogue, and that's like the whole Plato thing, is that everything is dialogue between characters. It's not written like sort of a textbook, but there's this conversation between these figures in the essay, kind of questioning the different models of government, and they kind of go through everything from like monarchy to aristocracy to oligarchies. At some point, democracy, in the way that people often sort of generically think of democracy, in the way that kind of actually was played out in ancient Greece, of just like pure democracy, that literally every single thing was like a mass vote, to the extent that people had voting rights. But the sort of the title of the book, The Republic, is his nod to like what he's implying is the solution, which is that, well, they kicked the tires on all of them, and they ultimately questioned some of the values of pure democracy in favor of saying that there's this idea that, what if there was this world where everybody kind of had their exactly purposely driven role in society, and almost like society was maxed out to efficiency of everybody's human potential. And the way that that would be executed is that there's these people that somehow, and obviously this is the flaw in the pitch, is like, who then decides who gets to be a philosopher king besides other philosopher kings? But there's these people that play this role as philosopher kings that sort of know everything. They're the really, really smart people. They're the people that are sort of designated or identified at birth as being super
Lee
smart.
Kuan Yew.
Right. Who's that? Sorry.
Lee Kuan Yew, a founder of Singapore, or the president of Singapore, prime minister of Singapore.
But it's interesting because it's sort of like this, like, you know, rhetorical reference point of like probably like an impossible world that we would ever organize around those principles, that anybody in society would ever adhere to the idea that there's any other human being or even collection of human beings that should, could, would do that. But I'm just thinking about this now. Is that what AI stands to become?
No, because
in some thought experiment, is it possible that somebody could create government GPT that is somehow programmed to actually make the right choices of where should money be spent, what is the best use of
I would argue that our egos are too big for that.
Probably. I'm just asking as a thought experiment. It's the only time I've ever thought that it could happen. I don't know if it will, but I'm saying at least the technology.
Well, I mean, to be fair, there's already analogs to what philosopher king, like if you look at Korea, you look at Singapore, you look at, I don't know, there's a lot of examples of smart dictators, aka philosopher kings, who, you know, made hard calls and were terrible, but also made hard calls in other ways that really forwarded their country. Right. And so, like, if we look at Lee Kuan Yew specifically, like, he was an extremely intelligent, arguably a genius, and who brought his nation, which had no resources, with like now what, 5 million people or whatever, they had zero resources. They were thrown out of Malaysia. Right. And yet he made a lot of the hard decisions that make that country, you know, a real player in the world. Right. So, I mean, that already exists, but I don't think that anybody is going to trust an AI. They might trust it as an aid, right? Which is what we already do. We have data scientists and, you know, data people who can take, and AI is like an evolution of data science in a lot of ways.
I think it's at best.
I don't know.
I think it's at best a sci-fi pitch for a story. I'm just saying, I've never believed humans en masse could actually adhere to this because there's too much potential for unrest. But it makes me wonder.
But there's no
technological capability that something could create a data.
I mean, could you have an AI in the cabinet? Like an AI agent that was a cabinet member?
I just imagine that, maybe,
or someone who was manning an AI, right?
I think there's a pitch for like a sci-fi movie that somebody might make where there's a world where there's humans and then there's aliens and there's robots, and it's the classic sort of like the figures of a great fantasy, you know, plot. Totally. But that at some point the aliens land on Earth and at some point observe the humans. The aliens are escaping some planet that got destroyed, that their planet got hit by a meteor or something, and this was their salvage vehicle. And they land on this place that's still around like Earth, but then they get here and all the people that live here seem to be fucking it up. And they seem to not get that they're in the process of ruining their own home. And then between the aliens and the robots, they see it very clearly what should happen next. But the people that live in this house don't get it. And I would imagine there being a very clean narrative for that movie of how the aliens and robots conspire to get rid of all the humans so that they can have a safe place to live.
Right.
I'm just saying, like when people, if you drew the logical conclusion of what could happen, a lot of things would be different. And that's maybe what the philosopher kings would ever come up with in some Platonic republic of like, what is the best use of people's resources and efforts? And to bring it back to like Hollywood and all this stuff, like I think like,
yeah, let's bring it back.
We're just
we're really far away from that.
But you're just watching an entire economy obsess over what do we do with these sort of imaginations and dreams that we turn into movies and TV shows. Like there's something disproportionate to me about
the funny thing
economy and the world's, frankly.
I mean, the funny thing to me is that AI is not the problem. I don't think it's the issue. I think it's the business models are the issue, and the business models have been the issue for a while, right? I mean, like, the moment that the internet was created, it ruined everybody immediately, because suddenly there was
a bold statement from you. I feel like I'm usually on the other side of this conversation with you.
No, because but I think where I will land, we might end up disagreeing anyway. But like ultimately, the internet said, "Hey, your business models suck because we can do this cheaper, faster, and even arguably better." And here comes, oh, you have films and TV that's been going on for 100 years. Well, guess what? I can create Mr. Beast, right? Like Mr. Beast can be created now in this new universe. And oh, you have taxis. Oh, we will create Uber drivers that will, bring hundreds, if not hundreds of millions of people, to finally use ride sharing. But we're going to cripple your business in the first place because your business is like gate kept, blah, 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 all these issues. So like every time the internet comes in touch, I feel like with any old business model, it's going to absolutely disrupt it. Right. And here it is coming to film and TV, and it is ruining it. It's not, if anything, Netflix is not the villain.
The consumer.
And YouTube is not, no, it's just the internet.
It's the one that buys it. No, but this is the point that I'm making.
What I'm saying is that
you can't get mad at the internet. You can't get mad at Netflix. You have to ultimately bear the responsibility as all of us are complicit.
Well, sure, this is a consumer, but the point that I'm making is that this was inevitable. The moment that an internet, which allowed me to come into direct contact with anything rapidly using a phone, came into existence, that was like every industry should have been like, oh shit, here we go. Including film and TV, and it was foolish for everybody to think, oh, this is going to continue forever. And then now here we are, right? And I mean, it's funny that we're going to watch Oppenheimer on Sunday because that I'm halfway through the book, and that's where he is at, right? That's where he was at, because in the 1930s and 1940s, like you started to see, the Soviets and communism become a more present concept in everyday society. And here he was, Oppenheimer himself was supporting unions and labor unions, all this kind of stuff, and of course he got raised for that. But like this is the moment that we're in, but that was precipitated by something else. Maybe it was kind of like the hangover from industrialization that leads Marx to write communism, which eventually grips the world over the course of a long period of time, whereas the internet introduces this idea, and now we are coming to grips with this reality. And we don't have, in my opinion, a philosophy to respond to it. We don't have a communism of our times, right? We don't have a Marx of our times that says, hey, this is a critique of our current world, and this is like what kind of world we should be moving towards, right?
I mean, it's interesting to bring up Marxism, especially in the context of the labor unions. I mean, like I just think, like, to me, that's sort of like the macro is that, like, the reason that the internet is so disruptive to everything is because it's still run on a currency of what is a moneymaker. Like the sort of the algorithm right. of the greater internet is run by people who have their hands on the buttons and the levers that say, okay, I've built this product to then maximize my profit in a taxi right. replacement, in a cable TV replacement, in a music distribution replacement.
Right.
So yeah, while there's still this driver of those new sort of forces that is still defining the success of the algorithm around, and can it make me more money, then yeah, commerce corrupts. Like commerce ruined the news industry before the internet even came. Like before the internet decided to show up to news, it was already screwed. Cable news was already destroying the underpinnings of journalism. Even sort of, it was already always there with tabloid journalism, and the way that like newspapers were already starting to siphon off the core value of journalism, because somebody had to like sell a crazier headline than the one. The New York Post had to be crazier than the New York Daily News. So it was already starting in micro levels, the same way people were making mixtapes and ripping music before Napster. But then eventually things got noisier and louder. But in the context of this, like journalism, if it was ever allowed to just be something that was consumed as a public good, which is what arguably still sort of happens with the BBC, whoever does pay attention to PBS, there's at least, you may or may not agree with every single thing, but it is an aggregate sequence of choices that doesn't set off to promote any agenda. It tends to have compassion and empathy built into their line of journalism. But I'm saying, so you can still sort of see what does it look like when commerce isn't the main utility. But yeah, the moment you had to add a commercial break between one piece of news before the other, and then you had multiple TV channels that were making really delicious advertising money off of delivering news, that undercut the main purpose of what was just getting people to know what really happened yesterday. Right. So I'm just saying, to me, that's like always been the example of like before the internet destroyed everything, as you're saying, like I think like commerce has been sort of a bit of like the main thing that sort of can take away whatever other values are the core driver.
But hasn't commerce been with us for like 5,000 years?
When it's within the ecosystem of how much does some centralizing power limit it. So in Plato's Republic, it is fully limited around what do the philosopher kings think is right and wrong, not to how much money can the philosopher kings make.
Well, I guess.
So
I mean, the philosopher kings never existed, right? I mean,
right.
That was
I'm using it as
a
thought exercise. But I'm saying the point is that in the thought experiment, it's where is the value judgment? Where's the value? So the BBC, somebody, and it's still, it doesn't sound like it's put up to a vote every single year in England, but it's generally supported. There's some kind of national pride in loving the BBC, but I'm sure there's cultural wars surrounding that stuff too. But like there's a general belief that it's good that we have this education forward institution that I know I can turn on and let my kids watch. It is generally valuable to me and my family as this thing that we gather around like a campfire and watch called the television. That is still this old school idea that still, I think people like shows that come off the BBC. I think it seems to be a big deal when you get a show on the BBC. It seems to be a source of national pride that we have this thing that we as a country in England, United Kingdom, have invested in to put out meaningful content that everybody should watch. And people seem to think that the people that work over there are probably good people, and I don't need to know a lot about them. There's a lot of trust there. There's an institution that has a very different set of values versus like, I think Ted Sarandos and those guys are going to get rich next year. Look at their Wall Street numbers. Look how awesome they're doing. Those are two very different conversations about two very similar delivery devices. One is I make a bunch of TV for the United Kingdom with the public good in mind, and that net, it doesn't matter to me how much advertisers like what we're doing. We're making content that should be on TV. And then there's Ted Sarandos saying like, I'm about to fucking flip this cable TV thing and jack all these motherfuckers, take all their money and tell them you don't even need it. And now I'm going to add advertising and pretend like it was my big idea. Like that is like a ruthless cycle of capitalism that as of yesterday, we're reading headlines about what an angel and a saint he is, that it's actually ultimately all has the artist in mind. That is a ruthless cycle of commerce and capitalism, which we can all just say is the way the world works. And maybe it is. I'm just saying it's not the only way it works.
I don't disagree with you there. I'm not sure that. I guess I'm not sure what your point is. Is it commerce? I'm
saying even when you say the content economy, there's a built-in assumption to what's valuable in that topic, which is that it's valuable.
But the BBC also runs on commerce, right? In the sense that
I don't think the BBC runs its annual I mean, now they're being forced to, by the way. They've 100% entered an era that they have
Right.
headlines to talk about how successful BBC studios are and how that, so they have been pushed into this 100%. What I'm saying is it's not too long ago that we can look at a different organizing principle for a culture economy of people watching movies.
Yeah,
TV
but
shows.
I guess I never have a rosy view of the past, like, or at least I've kind of,
I think PBS is
I have
fucking wonderful.
I
Like
have an
PBS
allergic.
has Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers. They were doing Nova
But
and
PBS is
science
not the past to
documentaries
me, but I'm
before,
just
but
that's not what represented the past. What I guess what from an abstract point of view, I'm just saying like I had a debate with one of our friends the other day, a few weeks ago. It was like we were so much better as hunter gatherers. I'm like I don't know. I don't think that's true. Like, so I never think that the past, and number one, the past is never as rosy as we remember it to be, and number two, the past was inevitably going to become the past. So in that respect, I'm kind of like, I don't know, the BBC, sure. I mean, it is a model that works for them, but I'm sure there's more to it than just that, right? I mean, they still have viewership, they still have to make money, they get the money from
I think just
somewhere,
because
right?
there's winners and losers in history doesn't mean that the losers of history don't deserve to be maybe looked at again of like, how did we maybe
Oh, no doubt.
sacrifice something along the way to what inevitably happens? I don't think anything is inevitable. That's a very like, there's no free will kind of like position.
Well, I definitely don't believe free will, but I guess that's a whole other philosophical thing. But what I do think, it's like, look, commerce has been around for a very long time, and in a lot of ways,
not in its purest form that
but that's debatable. Like, what does that mean? That's a whole
clearly,
podcast as well. Like, and we probably want to have any economists for that conversation. But like, what I do think is that, look, currency has been around for a long time. Commerce has resulted from that, and you know, the consumer and the people, and definitely the powers that be, have decided what is emphasis and what is not emphasis. But you know, at the end of the day, like, certain things have been merchandisable, like salt, right? Like, to me, it was inevitable that salt was going to make it, because we find salt to be fucking tasty. And so, of course, like, what the powers that be were responding to in terms of salt was that, hey, look, there's a demand for salt, so let's provide more salt and let's construct a whole economy around salt. Or, hey, everyone wants tea, so let's, you know, move our whole economy around tea, and then we're going to become multi-conglomerates. And so, like, when you introduce something as powerful as the internet, of course there's going to be a reorganization that is going to span decades, that is going to reorganize entire economies and entire industries, because we have to contend with this new element that is the internet, which everybody wants. Everybody wants a mobile phone, right? Like, it's not like Steve Jobs was like, you know, buying iPhones for people. People were buying iPhones, you know, because there's a demand for that.
It goes back to the point I was
know?
making at the beginning. The consumer is the protagonist in this story.
Oh, 100%. I never disagree with that. But what I'm saying is that, although the BBC is a model where from top down they're deciding what is good and they're supplying it with, you know, and they're funding it with tax dollars, or however that money is funded, the grants or whatever that the BBC is funded by, at the same time, it has to ultimately contend with, one, the internet, and it also has to contend with a ecosystem of content that is far beyond its shores, right? So, like, yes, the BBC has survived, but at the same time, like, it has also had to watch as Fox News and whatever has become arguably more relevant in a much more complex universe than the BBC came up in. I mean, BBC in a lot of ways is like Tom Cruise, right? Like, will we ever have like a Tom Cruise like that? Will we ever have a BBC like that? I don't know. You know, maybe out of this political moment, we might have things like that, because what is going to result? I mean, it's going to be, I don't see, I mean, this is back to the first conversation show that we've had. Like, I just don't see how this is solved. Like, I don't see how the studios make more money, you know, in an era where people don't want to go to the films as much. And I don't see how the writers get more money, because the ecosystem around writers and actors has been shitty for so long. It's been shitty for 100 years, 150 years. Like, it's so funny. I went to the Academy Museum. I'm watching these videos of people in the 1920s. Right. I'm like, this is very inspiring, or the 1930s or whatever.
Which museum?
Academy.
Oh,
Museum?
the Academy. Yeah.
Academy. I mean, you can see it on YouTube, right? So Academy Museum, like, don't even need to go to the Academy Museum, but it's like, you can watch all these films on YouTube of people hanging out in 1930s trying to make it as writers, actors, and musicians and whatever. And then I look at people in the same era today trying to make it, and it's the same economy that's been around for 100 years. As like people struggle, they struggle a lot. They have to be a waiter, they have to be like a manager at something, and then they get to audition on the side. They get a lawyer and they get to audition on the side. Like that universe has been there for 150 years at least, and probably existed way before that, right? It's like it's a privilege that we have, that more people are entering more creative arts, but it's also like remains the shittiest industries to be in from a perspective of money, right?
I mean, I think there's a few things you're as we do. It seems like we just jump in and out of clouds of ideas on our conversations. But like
Yeah.
I think for starters, I do think there's a difference between the film industry and the TV industry.
Sure.
The TV industry is a much more blue collar, accessible. There's jobs for everybody. It's returning businesses. These are seasons of TV shows. There's day jobs. It
Sure.
is
Sure.
like it is and that is why, frankly, me as an immigrant, I wasn't born here. I stupidly didn't follow the pattern and go into engineering and law, and I almost did. And my mom's probably gonna always rue the day that I skipped law school to chase a TV industry. But I told myself, and I still believe it was the right choice, is that I wasn't picking the art career. Like, oh, I really hope I make it. I'm going to go wait tables until somebody gives me a shot, which is the real, true, the brass tacks of why Hollywood is everything you just said. But it's always been that. TV industry was a much more, you know, labor movement model. Like there was lots of work. And it didn't claim to be art all the time. It was communications. There was news. There was talk shows. There's infomercials. There's all kinds of stuff. And that's why this is so particularly ruthless. Is because Netflix came at a moment where movies were starting to drift into TV, like premium television kind of replaced the artistry of film, and in terms of where that creative talent was migrating. So now this really is affecting all of the classes of Hollywood, this disruption. So I guess for starters, like I don't think the economy expanded opportunity in those 100 years. Like the people that chased a dream and waited tables in Hollywood 100 years ago and still do now are not the only types of people that come to Hollywood, so to speak. So for starters, I think that there is an evolution that did become a more sound business. And I say that defensively because I opted to do this instead of becoming a responsible person like a lawyer at some point in my life. Because I saw TV as this is a place where you work hard and you grow and you succeed. Yeah. Okay. So that is what we keep coming back to. That is the true pain point of what's happening in the streets right now, is you're watching people who thought this was an industry that had stability, long-term growth, a place to buy a home, pay for your kids' college tuition. That is what is in the process being challenged, not just the concept of IP or the AI stuff, which is contributing to that. Like that is what's being lost potentially. To go back to your, like, I don't know if anything like the BBC or whatever would ever happen again. And this is me putting on my fantasy hat because I'm going to reference Web3 as a solution to anything. Because clearly,
well, it might. I made the point that it might because of the current
right.
strike.
But
right?
I'm saying, to me, the mythology of things that are as purist or idealistic as the way I talk about the BBC. And I don't know, you're much more informed about tech history and tech current events than me, so maybe this is a reference that falls on deaf ears. But I was just recently reading an article about how like Wikipedia is still this like anomaly as a highly trafficked internet institution that never bit the apple of chasing commerce. They just and perhaps at their own expense, they might actually eventually succumb to so many market forces,
well,
because it's inevitability. Let me just finish the thought. So I'm just saying, like, it's possible that they're similarly in this world, that the inevitability, as you say, of all these market forces just make it so hard for these, sort of these older or maybe idealistic models. But I guess that's kind of where I'm coming from, is I don't want to assume the inevitability. I love Wikipedia for what it is. I love that I don't generally wonder whose agenda am I reading right now. When I go on Rotten Tomatoes and I generally just use it as the utility that it's become, it's this decentralized spirit of information and content that serves a purpose for me and the choice I make in my life that day, whether or not I'm going to go.
Well, Rotten Tomatoes is different because that is an ad-supported business, right?
But I'm saying the core thing that they do still functions in a decentralized manner. They're not like pumping the bags of which journalists are going to help Mission Impossible this week. It's manipulated, and all these things are imperfect analogies. I'm just saying this idea of decentralized kind of communities, I think might actually be the way that you might ever see something that doesn't succumb to these inevitabilities.
I mean, allow me to burst the Wikipedia bubble, though. That's
what I thought. That's what I thought you would do, by the
way. Wikipedia has to beg everybody for money once a year, which is fine.
The government, BBC begs the government for money,
which is fine. But also the real indictment to me about the BBC, or sorry, the Wikipedia is, and by the way, I do have to go soon, is not that their business model is alive and that they have all these volunteers, which is shitty, by the way, right? That they have a lot of people who do contribute considerably and don't necessarily get paid for it. So that's another thing. But they figured that out, and it's a public service to a certain extent. But what I think is actually shitty about Wikipedia is with Google, which is that
the way that they scrape all the data for their own.
No, it's not even about scraping the data. It is that generally most people are Googling, right? And people are going to
that's what the article was saying, is that in some ways Google is undoing, like, it's almost like when Facebook meant people stopped going to vice.com because it just like ran through their
yeah, it's like Google has inserted itself, and nothing wrong. I mean, Google's awesome, right? I mean, they have figured the internet out, right? Better than maybe any other company in its era, for sure, but via its algo and things like that. But like, you know, what they do end up doing is they surface a lot of content. They traffic a lot of people to Wikipedia, and they monetize that traffic that goes to Wikipedia. So I don't know. And Wikipedia doesn't see it a dime, right? And so there's a kind of dilemma there. It's like, and yet Google pays Apple $1 billion a year or whatever it is to put Google as the main search engine in the Safari browser, right? And so that's because Apple has leverage on Google. Apple can be like, yo, we're going to put our own thing. We're going to put Bing there because Bing has leverage on. So these are all these like, components. So Wikipedia doesn't have any leverage. So like, people are going to come to us anyway. So, all right, fine. Well, we just have to keep begging for money for millions of dollars every year to keep the servers running. Google's not going to pay us a dime, right?
I guess like that's right.
Google in 1 year could pay Wikipedia to run for, the $1 billion that it pays Apple, right? Which of course, there's a mathematics there, right? There's a financial thing there that if Google doesn't pay $1 billion to Apple to be the main search engine, they lose a massive amount of market share because Apple has a massive amount of market share. So there's all these components, but it still stands to reason that, hey, Google could pay, a huge amount to Wikipedia to keep it running for fucking 100 years, right? So anyway, but
that would effectively be a subsidy.
It would be a subsidy,
and that would be a choice, and that would be a choice that a powerful entity, normally a government or a very wealthy person, at some point uses their position of power, in this case measured in dollars, to say, no, this should happen.
Correct.
Which is basically why airlines exist. It's why corn is a stable commodity product. It's why trains run. It's because some powerful interest that controls, in this case, measured by dollars, power.
I mean, if the strike goes long enough, that's what might happen. Which I don't think the Republicans are going to like. So
maybe, but I guess like that's where I'm totally in Fantasyland dreaming, and when I sort of look at my
I mean, we might have to be in Fantasyland because at this point, I don't see the solution.
Because at some point we're feeling moral reactions to all this stuff. The entirety of the Screen Actors Guild's public relations is moral, like what should be. And I think the problem is that you're using a moral argument inside of like an economic puzzle. And in that economic puzzle, you're going to constantly ping pong your way around, like, well, which powerful structure actually has the trump card in this situation? Bounce. And I'm just dreaming, and that's why it bums me out that Web3 might just turn out to be a fad, and that all these things we dreamt about a couple of years ago while we were staring at monkeys could just be this sort of like, like what happened in the 90s, sort of nostalgia doc series 10 years from now, of like, that underpinning a lot of that silliness, there was a lot of people that were dreaming of this stuff. They were tantalized by a world that doesn't go to church the way that it used to And now we're finding this feeling of congregation and shared values. And we were supposedly using DAOs to make decisions, like all these fantasy land things. Like I'm not pitching it or even supporting it. I'm just saying it was a really interesting counterpoint to the general inevitability assumption, as you, I think, said on this conversation, that things will, they just are. Like Google's really powerful, Apple's really powerful. You know, people have a lot of money over here. How are you going to go against these forces? That's all the true. And I've lived inside that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if it, I
But
mean,
when I
in
feel
my
moral,
opinion, if it wasn't Netflix, it would have been somebody else
but when I feel
operating on
my
that level.
moral, when I feel my moral resistance to this, it isn't just assuming there's some other economic solution hiding. It's that maybe the underpinnings of this whole conversation are designed to fail, and that
Well,
yes,
I mean,
we're going to get screwed.
I
you know?
blame, not to be too Democrat about it, but I blame, and I'm not necessarily a Democrat, but I blame Reagan. I mean, I think the slash
investing, or
I mean, I think I honestly look at any of these economic issues as a result of, and inflation as well. Like, it goes back to, I mean, well, this is extremely complicated and I can't reduce it to all of that, but like, I do think the mass inequality, which I think this is a product of, right? Like all these content and economy things, they exhibit mass inequality, which is a symptom of a larger inequality in our American and global economy. And that is, to me, rooted in like easing on taxing the rich. And that happens around Reagan's era. So,
and again, I'm
trickle down economics,
I
which
would
doesn't
love-
work. Trickle down economics is not.
But I would
like,
love to have an
doesn't work.
economist in this conversation, because they'd keep both of us smarter. But
Right,
that is why, to me, like there's sort of like a chasing the news cycle way to discuss what's happening in the strikes, and like, but it is a deeper systemic question of what is better of like
Right.
the way things quote unquote should work. And I think like while we're subject to the PR of all these different players, and we go, well, maybe Ted Stringvis is a nice guy because he did a good piece on CNBC, which is literally a squawk box to sort of promote rich people. Like the channel. I'm just saying, like we're products of the same memes,
Yeah.
Anyway, you gotta go.
I do have to go.
Here's one thing that I'd say in terms of
we didn't talk about Tom Cruise, by the way.
Well, we started, and then maybe
like
that's
5
the format.
minutes.
But maybe that's the format, by the way, that it's sort of
I don't hate it. As long as we kind of don't return too much to the same thing over and over again.
Did you? I guess I was going to say, like, having done this for a week, sort of with you now, I kind of like the idea, whether off async or even as part of the format, of like, what's my favorite thing that came up this week? Because it is. You
mean at the end of the episode,
or in real life? But there's like a version of intellectual therapy that is just kind of like chopping it up and like sort of free flowing conversation, like just like you sort of find stuff the same way psychotherapy discovers stuff. And I don't know, there was a moment that in talking to you, like I really liked this sort of epiphany for me, that we talk about how like Netflix like innovated this model. And I guess like in the way that this connects to other stuff that I'm interested with, these little experiments in Web3 and things that we're seeing happen with AI, is I actually love thinking that actually the consumer is the scientist that's innovating, and by trying things out. Like people started making mixtapes, and then it was discovered that maybe like that there's a better consumer experience that sort of facilitates that, which is what would inevitably happen with MP3s. And like the consumer wanted to just time shift everything. They started doing it with TiVo and DVR, and then eventually somebody's like, well, let's create a whole platform that just does that. So I don't know, to me that's
wait, so what's your point?
My point is that the consumer is the hero of the story of technology. It isn't the inventors or the business people. Like we're always the ones that they chase our behavior, or they try to read the DNA of what are we doing with this. And that's what interests me with like what I still see playing out in some of these Web3 spaces, is I think like what Jack Butcher is doing with his project OPEPN and his community, I think is a grand experiment for like, what do people do at consuming and transacting culture? And like, that's why I get excited about Web3 still. I'm still seeing novel experiments play out there.
Well, you're going to get the last word on that because I really do have to go.
All right, bye.
That's a whole other topic you're introducing on top of, but all right.
No, but that to me is my takeaway from this week.
I thought you were. Oh, I see. That's your takeaway. Okay.
My takeaway is that
I thought you were introducing a format. That's what I was waiting for.
Well, this is the format that we both say. Here's my favorite thing we came up with this week.
Oh, my favorite thing is that I learned that I don't know if you're asking or you're just pitching that, but
Both. I don't know. If it inspires you, do whatever you want with it.
my favorite thing is that I learned that TV is more stable than film,
Big time.
but still shitty. That's what I'll say.
It's still subject to the same types of decision makers, but
Still subject to inequality, still subject to a large group of people trying to make it into that
but
industry.
this is where in another episode, if you look at the history of
But yeah, we can't. I gotta go.
yeah, but I'm not, I'm
Yeah.
just saying, like, you can see the experiment that it